The wind howled across the snow-covered plains like it had a grudge against anyone daring to be outside. Snowflakes whipped sideways, stinging like tiny needles against the cowboy's face. He pulled his worn leather coat tighter around his broad shoulders, squinting into the white blur. Out here, miles from the nearest town, the world felt empty, frozen, and merciless. His cabin, small, sturdy, made of rough timber and stone, was his only sanctuary, a place where he could survive the winter without the town's noise, the gossip, and the distractions of people. He had chosen this life, this solitude, because it suited him. But even he had to admit, tonight the loneliness gnawed at him. That's when he saw her, or, more accurately, a shape moving like a shadow through the storm. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. Out here, a lone traveler in this weather could easily get lost. Or worse. She was bundled in a coat too thin for this kind of cold, and her arms hugged herself as if she could physically hold the freezing air at bay. Her face, pale from the wind, peeked out from a hood, her eyes wide, searching for some sign of safety. "Hey!" he called, his voice rough from years of shouting over winds and animals, but carrying enough warmth to cut through the storm. "It's freezing out here. Come on over to my cabin." She froze, caught between instinct and desperation. Anyone stranded in this blizzard could be a threat, a trap, or worse, but staying outside meant risking frostbite, maybe even death. Slowly, cautiously, she started moving toward him, her boots crunching over the icy crust of snow. The cowboy didn't move. He just watched, feeling a strange mix of curiosity and concern. Something about the way she carried herself, nervous but determined, reminded him that out here, survival was about more than just strength. It was about heart, cleverness, and guts. And she had all three, even if she didn't know it yet. By the time she reached the cabin door, her fingers were red, her lips chapped, and her hair plastered to her cheeks by the storm. The cowboy swung the heavy wooden door open, letting the warm air of the cabin rush out like a welcome wave. She hesitated for just a second, scanning the interior, a modest place. A few chairs, a table, a roaring fireplace, and then stepped inside. Relief washed over her, and the snow clinging to her coat began to melt in the cabin's heat. He nodded at her, his eyes flicking to the fire. "Sit by the hearth. You look like you've been through hell out there." He didn't need to ask questions yet. Right now, she needed warmth, not interrogation. He grabbed a blanket and draped it over her shoulders. It was a simple gesture, but it was enough to start breaking the ice between them, literally and figuratively. As she sank into the chair, letting the fire's glow wash over her, he noticed her shivering slowly subside. There was something quiet about her, a mix of alertness and wariness, but also gratitude. That was the first spark, small, almost imperceptible, but it was enough for him to feel the first stirrings of curiosity about this stranger who had wandered into his frozen world. Outside, the storm raged on, relentless and unforgiving. Inside, the cowboy and the stranger shared silence for a moment, the kind that felt heavy with possibility. Neither spoke of who they were or where they came from yet, but both understood something unspoken. This freezing encounter would be the start of something neither of them could have anticipated. The snowstorm had brought them together, and in the harshest, coldest part of the world, that was sometimes all it took to ignite a story that would warm even the loneliest hearts. The cabin smelled like wood smoke and pine, a comforting scent that immediately made the stranger feel a little less frozen, a little less stranded. The cowboy had built it himself years ago, a place meant to withstand the harshest winters and the loneliest nights. The walls were rough-hewn logs, the floor uneven in spots, but there was a rugged charm to it, practical, unpretentious, and honest. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, throwing shadows that danced across the room. Flickering over a worn armchair, a table stacked with a few canned goods, and a small bookshelf holding a mix of novels, journals, and a dog-eared Bible. The cowboy leaned against the doorframe, watching her settle in. "You look like you've been through hell," he said, his voice a little softer now. The storm outside was still raging, but inside, the heat made the world feel safer somehow. He gestured toward the chair near the fire. "Sit. Take your boots off if you want. You're gonna freeze otherwise." She hesitated for a moment, as if measuring his words, then dropped her bag by the door and carefully peeled off her snow-encrusted boots. She set them neatly to the side, an instinctive move, polite but cautious. The firelight caught her eyes, and he noticed a flicker of something, fear, maybe, but curiosity too. She was wary, but not completely shut down, and that made him respect her. Most people out here would have panicked, or worse, tried to hide from him. But she had kept moving, kept herself alive. "So, you live out here alone?" she asked, voice quiet but steady. Her tone wasn't accusatory or judgmental, just honest curiosity. He shrugged, settling into a chair opposite hers. "Yeah, ain't much of a townfolk type. People get loud, messy. I like the quiet. Gives me time to think, or not think at all. You know how it is." She nodded slowly, wrapping the blanket around her tighter. "I can imagine, must be. Peaceful, though?" There was a subtle hesitation in her words, like she wasn't sure if peace was something to hope for or just another trap. He chuckled softly, a sound like gravel rolling down a hillside. "Peaceful? Sometimes. Cold, miserable, lonely. Depends on the day." His eyes flicked to the fire, catching the shadows as they danced. He was used to silence, but somehow having someone here made it less heavy. They talked in short bursts at first, cautious exchanges, testing the waters. She asked about the cabin, how he built it, where he got his supplies. He answered honestly, a little gruffly, but without arrogance. He noticed her eyes lingering on the small personal touches, the old guitar resting against the wall, a handmade quilt draped over the chair, the books she had already glanced at. She seemed genuinely interested, not just polite, and it made him feel lighter, a little less like a lone wolf surviving the world by himself. "You ever get tired of being alone?" she asked, suddenly, and he froze slightly. It was a question he'd never admit to anyone else. Out here, admitting loneliness felt like weakness. But her tone wasn't judgmental. It wasn't pity either. It was curiosity mixed with understanding. "Every now and then," he admitted, gruffly. "But mostly, I'm used to it. Ain't nothing to do but keep moving, keep surviving. But it gets long sometimes." He gave a half smile, and for a brief moment, the firelight seemed to warm more than just their skin. She smiled back, a little shyly, and that tiny gesture cracked some of the ice around him. For the first time in years, he realized that having someone else here, someone alive, awake, and real, made the cold outside seem less threatening. They continued talking, cautiously at first, sharing small stories about their lives. She didn't reveal everything, and he didn't push. But the conversation had a rhythm, like two people figuring out a dance together. The storm raged outside, but in that cabin, the world narrowed to just the two of them. For a few hours at least, the cold, the loneliness. And the danger felt manageable because they weren't entirely alone. By the time the night had fully settled, the fire burned low. But a different kind of warmth lingered between them, a subtle understanding, a fragile trust, and the beginnings of something neither had expected when they first met in the blizzard. The snowstorm outside had no plans to let up, and the cowboy and the stranger were stuck in the cabin for the night. At first, the silence between them had been polite, the kind you get when two strangers are trying not to offend one another. But now, hours in, it had shifted into something different, a rhythm. a connection that neither of them expected. The woman's eyes roamed around the cabin, taking in the small details that gave away the cowboy's life. There was the old guitar in the corner, scuffed and well-loved, with a few strings missing. There was a hand-carved wooden rocking chair, worn smooth from years of use. And then there was the quilt draped over her chair, clearly handmade, with mismatched patches sewn with care. She couldn't help but let a small smile cross her face. It was the first sign of comfort she had felt since wandering into the storm. "You made this?" she asked, nodding toward the quilt. He shrugged, a little embarrassed. "Yeah, my ma taught me when I was a kid. Figured it'd keep someone warm one day. Never thought it'd be you." That got a chuckle out of her, a genuine laugh that lit up the cabin. The sound was small, but it cut through the tension of the storm outside. He felt it like a spark, a little jolt of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He realized then that she wasn't just a stranger in need. She was someone curious, someone observant, someone who noticed the little things. Conversation started to flow more naturally after that. They traded small stories about their lives, not the deep secrets. Not yet, but funny moments, little hardships, things that made them human. She told him about getting lost on a trail once, nearly freezing overnight, and he laughed, not cruelly, but with recognition. He told her about a time a horse bolted with him hanging on for dear life, and she gasped and then laughed, shaking her head. For the first time in a long while, he felt a genuine connection, not just the passing politeness of survival. Then, something unexpected happened. The woman, noticing a small leak in the roof letting a few icy drips onto the floor, jumped up without hesitation. "Here, let me help," she said, grabbing a cloth and moving the furniture to catch the water. He froze for a moment, surprised. Most people would sit tight, scared of doing anything in this rough, unfamiliar place. But she was resourceful, brave, and unafraid. Watching her, he realized he had been underestimating her. She wasn't fragile or helpless. She was clever, capable, and determined. And in that moment, his respect for her grew. She wasn't just someone to keep safe, she was someone he could learn from. Someone whose presence didn't just change the night. It changed the way he saw the world around him. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside, the atmosphere had shifted. What began as simple sheltering from the cold had turned into companionship, the kind that felt rare and precious in a life defined by isolation. They moved naturally around each other, sharing space without awkwardness, laughing quietly when something funny happened, and exchanging glances that lingered a moment too long. By the time the fire had burned low, the unexpected connection was undeniable. It wasn't romantic, at least. Not yet, but it was something more than casual conversation. It was trust forming in real time, respect growing in the quiet moments between words, and a mutual recognition that they weren't entirely alone anymore. Outside, the snowstorm was relentless, a reminder of the harsh world beyond the cabin walls. Inside, they had discovered warmth, not just from the fire, but from the connection they had formed in a night that neither of them would forget. And though neither admitted it aloud, they both knew that the night had already changed something fundamental. They had each found someone who could break through the loneliness that had defined their lives for far too long. It was a connection neither had anticipated, but one they both silently hoped would last beyond the storm. The night had grown quieter in the cabin. The fire's crackle now the only sound besides the occasional gust of wind rattling the logs. The cowboy sat back in his chair, arms crossed, watching the woman as she moved around the small space. She wasn't just keeping warm anymore. She was observing, learning, and even helping. At first, he thought she was just curious, most strangers were, but then he realized it was more than that. She had initiative, and that was something he rarely encountered. She walked over to the small table, where he kept his supplies and began organizing things, stacking cans, straightening the few jars of preserves. He frowned slightly, unsure if he should speak up. Most people would have left the cabin alone, not dared touch his things. But she didn't ask permission. She just acted. "You're pretty handy," he said, raising an eyebrow, his voice a mixture of surprise and amusement. She glanced at him with a sly grin. "Been fending for myself most of my life. Don't worry, I won't rearrange the furniture without asking." That small, bold gesture, the way she had taken control without hesitation, hit him harder than he expected. For someone so quiet and wary just a few hours ago, she now seemed fearless, confident, and capable. It wasn't just the physical act. It was her mindset. She didn't wait for someone else to solve the problem. She acted. She contributed. And that struck a chord deep in him. The storm outside hadn't relented, and a draft from a small crack in the door made him realize the firewood might not last the night if they didn't tend it. He reached for a log, about to adjust the fire, when she jumped in. "I got it," she said, taking the log from him. Without waiting, she positioned it perfectly, feeding the flames with a precision that made him blink. He wasn't used to letting anyone take charge. But he found himself quietly impressed. For the first time, the cowboy felt the walls he had built around himself begin to crumble, not because she forced him to, but because her confidence, her calm competence, and her willingness to act so naturally were disarming. He realized she wasn't just grateful for his shelter. She was an equal partner in surviving the storm. Then came the move that truly changed everything. While getting water from a small kettle, she slipped slightly on the cabin floor, her coat catching on the chair. Reflexively, he reached out to steady her. Their hands touched, and for a brief moment, the storm outside faded completely. He looked into her eyes and saw something he hadn't seen in years: trust. Not the hesitant trust of someone needing help, but a genuine trust in him, and just as importantly, in herself. "You okay?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but his heart was racing. "I'm fine," she said with a small, confident laugh, brushing herself off. But the spark was there, unspoken, undeniable. That little slip, that simple moment of physical connection, shifted something in him. He wasn't just a protector anymore. He was part of a partnership, and that was a frighteningly new feeling. The rest of the night passed in a blur of conversation, quiet laughter, and small acts of teamwork. They shared duties, keeping the fire going, arranging blankets, preparing a small meal. Every move she made reinforced what he had begun to realize. She had agency, courage, and a heart that matched her strength. Her presence challenged him, shifted his perspective, and slowly melted the walls of isolation he had built around himself. By the time the fire burned low, the cabin felt different. The air between them had changed. He no longer saw her merely as a stranger in need. She had become someone who could stand beside him, someone whose boldness and decisiveness had altered the course of the night and perhaps his life. Outside, the storm still raged, but inside, a new warmth had settled. It wasn't just from the fire. It was the unexpected connection that had grown from her simple yet profound actions, the move that changed everything. And deep down, the cowboy knew that after tonight, nothing would ever be quite the same again. The storm outside had no mercy, and even the cabin, sturdy as it was, felt small and vulnerable against the howl of the wind and the weight of snow pressing down on the roof. The cowboy paced near the window, peering through the frosted glass. His brow furrowed. He had stocked enough firewood and supplies for a typical winter night, but this storm was relentless. The snow wasn't just cold. It was dangerous. One misstep outside could mean frostbite or worse, being trapped far from safety. The woman sat by the fire, wrapping her blanket tightly around herself, her eyes flicking toward him every now and then. She wasn't helpless, far from it, but she understood the stakes. This wasn't just a casual blizzard. This was nature at its harshest, and it demanded respect. "Looks like we might be stuck a while," he muttered. More to himself than to her, though she heard him. "I can help," she said. Almost casually, though her tone carried weight. "We can make sure the fire stays going, check the roof for leaks, and ration the water. You don't have to do it all alone." Her initiative caught him off guard again. He had spent years surviving alone, trusting only himself. Letting someone else take responsibility felt strange, but he found himself grateful. "All right," he admitted, handing her a bucket of water. "Let's do this together." They moved through the cabin with a rhythm born of necessity. She checked the roof, using her small frame to reach spots he would have needed a ladder for. He stoked the fire, keeping it strong enough to warm both of them. Together, they inventoried the supplies, discussing how long they might be trapped and what they'd need to survive. Each action, each small decision, reinforced the trust they were building. Then came a more pressing challenge. One of his horses, stabled near the cabin, had gotten restless. The wind had battered the barn door, and he feared the animals might break free or injure themselves. "Damn it," he muttered, grabbing his coat. He didn't want her to go outside, it was dangerous, but she refused to be left behind. "I can handle it," she said firmly. "We do this together." They stepped into the blizzard, the wind slicing at their faces and the snowdrift swallowing their boots. She leaned on him at first, letting him guide her through the deeper drifts. But when they reached the barn, she moved with confidence, calming the horses and securing the door. He couldn't help but notice her determination. She wasn't just surviving. She was thriving in conditions that would have broken most people. Back inside, they huddled by the fire, exhausted but alive. You handled that well," he said, still catching his breath. "Most folks would have panicked out there." She shrugged, brushing snow from her coat. "You learn to keep your head when you've got nowhere else to run. Panic doesn't help anyone." Her words stuck with him. He had spent years relying on instinct and muscle, but tonight, he realized there was more to surviving than toughness. It was trust, teamwork, and knowing when to let someone else take the lead. And for the first time, he wasn't just surviving. He was learning to share that burden, to depend on another person without feeling weak. The night stretched on, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. Every decision mattered: how much firewood to burn, how much water to ration, how to keep the horses safe. But with her at his side, even the harshest choices felt manageable. They weren't just sharing tasks, they were sharing responsibility. Building a silent bond that went beyond words. By the time the first light of dawn filtered through the frosted windows, the storm had started to ease. The cabin was still standing, the horses were safe, and both of them had survived the night's trials. But more than that, they had survived together. The cowboy realized that this partnership, the trust, the respect, the shared decisions had changed something fundamental in him. He wasn't just a lone survivor anymore. He had someone beside him who could face danger, think clearly, and act decisively. Outside, the snow lay thick and glistening, a reminder of the storm's fury. Inside, the cowboy and the woman looked at each other with newfound understanding. They had weathered the worst together, and nothing would ever feel quite as lonely again. By morning, the storm had finally spent its fury. The snow lay thick across the plains, sparkling under a pale winter sun, untouched and pristine. The cabin, battered but standing, was warm and safe inside, a stark contrast to the harsh world outside. The cowboy sat by the fire, sipping the last of the coffee they'd brewed, and felt a strange calm settle over him. The night had changed everything, not just because they survived, but because surviving together had shifted something inside him. The woman stirred from her chair. stretching and brushing a few stray flakes of snow from her coat. Her hair, damp from the storm, clung to her cheeks, but she looked alive, alert, and somehow brighter than she had the night before. He noticed the subtle confidence in her movements, the way she moved through the cabin as if she belonged here, not just as a guest, but as someone whose presence mattered. "You okay?" he asked, voice low, cautious. "Better than I expected," she said with a faint grin. "Thanks for keeping me from freezing out there." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah, you kept yourself alive just fine. I just helped a little." The words were modest, but there was honesty in them. He wasn't used to acknowledging his feelings or his dependence on anyone, but somehow it didn't feel awkward to say it now. They moved quietly around the cabin, finishing the simple breakfast they'd managed to pull together. There was no rush, no tension. Just two people who had faced a storm together and come out stronger. Every glance, every small smile carried unspoken recognition. They weren't the same people who had met in the blizzard. That encounter had forever altered their lives. The cowboy thought about the last night, about how he had underestimated her at first, how he had assumed she'd be scared, fragile, maybe even helpless. She had surprised him at every turn, her bravery, her quick thinking, her boldness, and her willingness to act. She had changed his perception of what companionship could be, of what it meant to trust and to lean on another person without shame. And what now? She asked, finally breaking the comfortable silence. He looked at her, squinting against the morning sun streaming through the frost-lined windows. "I guess. We figure it out," he said. "Life goes on, storms come and go, but you're welcome here, anytime." Her expression softened, a subtle warmth in her eyes. There was no immediate declaration of love, no sudden promise, but there was understanding, a silent acknowledgement that their lives were intertwined now, in ways that neither could ignore. She had entered his frozen world, changed its rhythm, and left an imprint on his heart that wouldn't fade. Outside, the world was quiet, except for the occasional crunch of snow under the horses' hooves. The cowboy and the woman stepped onto the porch together, taking in the fresh air, the wide expanse of white stretching to the horizon. The blizzard had ended, but the lessons it brought, the need for trust, courage, and partnership remained. They didn't rush to make plans, didn't force words that didn't feel ready. Instead, they simply existed in that shared moment, comfortable in each other's presence, knowing that everything had changed. The cowboy no longer felt the crushing weight of loneliness, and the woman no longer felt like a stranger wandering in a frozen world. Together, they had faced danger, made decisions, and discovered that survival meant more than endurance. It meant connection. As the morning sun reflected off the snow, warming the cabin in a gentle light, the cowboy realized that life had handed him something unexpected, a chance at companionship, trust, and perhaps even love. And the woman, too, carried a quiet certainty that this encounter had shifted her path. The storm was over, but the impact of that night, the laughter, the small crises, the shared responsibilities, the trust, the unexpected courage would last a lifetime. Both of them stepped forward into the new day forever changed, their hearts a little fuller, their world a little warmer, and their lives richer for having found each other in the coldest moment imaginable.